Hey guys, what is up? LCM PhD here with a review of Universal Basic Income. Is this a plan for 2019 or for 2119? That's the question we're going to ask. And what we want to start off with is just what is UBI? So UBI should have three things, right? Universal Basic Income should be universal. Everyone gets it regardless of income. It should be basic so that it's not making anybody rich. It's providing a minimum level of support in order to afford food, housing, etc. And it's an income, right? Meaning you receive it on a regular basis. So you should receive it either, bi-weekly or monthly. That said, there are a lot of open questions about UBI. How much should it be? How is it financed? What current programs can it replace and which current programs should remain? What about kids? Should they get a universal basic income? Should it go to their parents? Should it go to an account in their name? Should it be identical for everyone, or should some people get more based on region or urban versus rural? And finally, how does UBI affect incentives to work? So we're going to tackle these questions one by one, and then at the end we're going to do a little bit of an example of one possible way to provide and fund UBI. So how much should UBI be? Well, in order to figure that out, we need to sort of think about how much we produce, how much we earn in a year. So GDP per capita in the United States is around $60,000. That's total production, GDP, which is about $20 trillion in nominal terms, divided by the total population, which is around 300 million. Disposable income per capita, which is your average income after taxes and transfers, is almost 48,000. And so most people who talk about a universal basic income for a country like the United States suggest somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 per year. The number we're going to use in this video is $12,000 per year, so that's $1,000 a month, comes out to a nice round number. That would be about 20% of GDP, or somewhere around $4 trillion. That means that we need to raise that much in taxes, net of any spending decreases, which we'll talk about. Those taxes are currently around $2 trillion in terms of federal taxes. This would be a pure transfer, right? So this is taking money from one person, giving it to somebody else, as opposed to taxing and spending on soldiers or math teachers or roads, right? So it's a different type of spending, much more like Social Security than like something like national defense. So how should it be financed? Well, the 2018 tax reform made the individual tax deduction $12,000, right? That works out nicely for our example, meaning you don't pay tax on any of your first $12,000 of income. So with a UBI, we could start taxing everything after the UBI of $12,000. So everything you earn would be taxed, and we could still have a progressive tax structure, right? So that the income you earn first is taxed at a lower rate than the $1 million that you earn, and anything above that. But we would definitely have to start taxing in order to afford this type of program. It would definitely require higher taxes, right? And most proponents, favor keeping the progressive tax structure that we have. And of course, one of the questions is how those higher taxes will affect individuals' incentives to work. So what programs can it replace? Well, we'll go through the math in just a minute, but if the UBI is generous enough, it could replace all or part of a number of safety net programs, right? Temporary aid to needy families, food stamps or SNAP, housing, Section 8 and public housing. Now, this is going to be one of the trickier ones because housing expenses vary wildly from region to region and city versus rural. Supplemental security income, EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and Social Security, both disability and retirement. Now, as we're going to see, I wouldn't recommend cutting 100% of all of these programs, but we could cut a number of them as long as we're providing a generous enough UBI. And that would be a lot of money saved, right? We spend a little over $1 trillion on income programs, most of that coming through Social Security, either in retirement, where the bulk of it is, $758 billion, or for disabled workers, which is 132 billion. You can see those are both the most generous programs as well, followed by SSI and housing. Food stamps and temporary aid to needy families, while they vary by state, are less generous and less costly. So which program should UBI not replace? Well, the biggest one is healthcare, right? So we spend a lot on Medicare and Medicaid at the federal level, and of course Medicaid on the state level as well. UBI would not provide enough income for recipients to buy health insurance, right? And overall, economists have known since the 1960s in Ken Arrow that the market does not do a good job of providing either health care or health insurance. So there's adverse selection, there's moral hazard, there's big problems in that market. The most efficient way to provide health insurance and healthcare is through a universal public system. That's going to be a different video, but there are a lot of reasons, of course, that we haven't adopted that yet. It also wouldn't replace unemployment benefits, right? So unemployment benefits are an insurance scheme that's mostly funded by payroll taxes on employers. And it's possible we could reduce some of those benefits, right? Because you wouldn't need necessarily quite as much. You lose your income. That UBI is there to help you, but it's not there to replace all of the income that you lost. Of course, unemployment benefits don't replace all of that income either, but it would replace more than the UBI. What about kids? So some suggestions include children, providing them with a universal basic income. Some others do not. But there are other programs that suggest providing children with a lump sum when they turn 18. And it probably makes sense to include them. The suggestion we're going to go with here is giving 50% of the UBI for children to their parents so that they can afford to buy them food, clothes, housing, etc. And 50% would be put in account in the child's name, which they would be able to access when they turn 18. So should UBI be the same for everyone? Should it change based on where you live? Should it change based on your family history? Universal programs like Medicare and Social Security are generally much more politically popular than programs that are not universal. And so for that reason, I think it should probably be universal, but there could be a discussion about cost of living adjustments depending on where you live. For most people, so in total, of course, the UBI should be designed to be, on average, zero, right? It's going to help the people with lower income. It's going to be more costly for the people with higher income, but that's the whole point, right? It's a social safety net. It's there for people who need it. But someone earning average income should basically see no difference. Their benefit will be $12,000, their taxes will be $12,000 higher, the net will be zero. So then one question is, well, what happens when you give people $12,000 a year? How does it change their work incentive? So one, objection may be that they choose not to work or not to work as much if they have this extra income. And what we see, at least in terms of taxes, is that when people have higher taxes, there is not a huge effect, which we'll talk about in a minute. And that's probably the same here. The biggest difference is possibly second earners in two-income families, right? So, it could be that one parent, for example, chooses to work less and stay home with the children or stay home and take care of the house as opposed to now. On the other hand, one benefit of a universal basic income is that people will be able to focus more on what they really enjoy doing. They can afford the training that they need. They can afford the education that they need. And that can allow them either to increase their future earnings or at least to have them earn something in a job that they enjoy. Now, another big important labor market issue is that a universal basic income would increase the bargaining power of workers vis-a-vis their employers, excuse me. So that would mean that employers would have to potentially offer higher wages and better benefits, better working conditions in order to get people to work for them. If we do use, a progressive tax structure to finance UBI as opposed to something like a wealth tax, then we have to think about how that will impact people's incentives to work. Overall, there's not too much evidence that people work less when faced with a higher marginal tax rate. maybe at the very highest tax rates, that were, 90+% in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s. But overall, economists have estimated that if you want to maximize your tax revenue, taking into account the behavioral responses, the top marginal tax rate at the very highest income should be, somewhere between 70 and 80%. And most research suggests there's very little relationship between tax rates and overall economic growth. And in fact, we enjoyed our fastest 2 decades of growth, between, say, the late 40s and late 60s, when we had the highest marginal tax rates. So let's do an example. So let's say we're giving $12,000 a year to everybody in the country, right? Every citizen receives $12,000 per year. If you're over 18, you get $500 deposited into a bank account on the 1st and 15th every month. This could have the added benefit of bringing everybody into the banking system. A lot of people still are excluded from the financial system, and this would force them in. Under 18, half goes into the parent account, so $6,000 a year. Half goes into a child account, which is held until the child turns 18. The cost would be about $3.7 trillion per year, or 18.5% of GDP. So that's a large cost, right? It's going to require higher taxes. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. There would obviously be some minor administrative costs, but compared to the $3.7 trillion, they're going to be negligible. Which programs could we eliminate? Well, I think we could eliminate all of temporary aid to needy families. You're getting money directly. SNAP, getting money directly. Earned income tax credit. This program would dwarf anything that you would receive from those 3 programs. And SSI from Social Security. I don't think we should eliminate all of housing, Social Security for disabled workers, and Social Security for retirement, but I do think we could eliminate about half of it. That means we could save about almost $700 billion, meaning we need about $3 trillion of new taxes, or about 15% of GDP. So how would we do this? Well, this is one possibility, right? So these are our current tax rates based on the latest tax reform. It tops out at 37% at income over $500,000 for an individual, or over $600,000 for a married couple. I would increase those, starting at 30%. So every dollar you earn, you're paying at least 30% of federal income tax in order to finance the universal basic income. That would go up to 50% at $500,000 for individuals, and 70% at income over $10 million for individuals, or $12 million for families. So those are higher tax rates than we currently have. Of course, everybody's getting $12,000 tax-free, no matter what. And these tax rates would put us about back where we were in the 1970s, and still significantly lower than we were in the sort of 40s, 50s, and 60s, when the top marginal tax rate was, 90+%. So would this raise enough revenue? Well, the answer is maybe. If everybody keeps working the same, then I would say yes, right? If there are no behavioral responses to these higher marginal tax rates. But if there are behavioral responses, right, if it makes people less likely to work, if it makes people at the higher incomes less likely to work because of the higher tax rates, then it won't raise enough revenue. And that's a big open question, and one that we would have to think about before putting a program like this into place. So let's go through a few families and see how this would affect them. So if we think about a single parent with 2 children under 18, if that parent is working at a minimum wage job, earning between $15,000 and $20,000 per year, depending on which state he or she lives in, they could receive an additional potentially $15,000 in benefits, although you'd have to apply for all of them. You have to file taxes in order to earn the EITC. So they could be earning, around $30,000, but I think that's at the highest end, right? And that assumes that you're working 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. Under a UBI plan, they would receive $24,000 for nothing, right? So replaces almost all of the income without any work requirement. If they continue working, then they would receive the $24,000 in UBI plus around $13,000 in net income for a total of $37,000. So they would definitely be better off. And then I think it's an open question about whether someone like this would choose to work or not, because the benefit would be somewhat lower. But they may choose to work, a certain number of hours so that they can have some extra income, but also take care of children. If we think about median family income, so this is median, remember, is where 50% are poor and 50% are richer. That's about $95,000. So two earners and two children. Currently, they pay somewhere between $10,000 and $13,000 in federal income tax, probably. They would receive $36,000 in UBI, so that's two adult shares plus two half-child shares. And their taxes would go up to about $33,000. Net, they would receive an additional $16,000 per year, right? And remember, this is median, not mean, which is the reason that they benefit. And then they also have the additional child half shares going into individual accounts, which the children would be able to access when they turn 18. A high-income family, with two earners plus two children, say they're earning $250,000. They're currently paying somewhere between $45,000 and $50,000 in federal income tax. They would receive $36,000 in UBI. Taxes would increase to about $95,000. Their income would fall by approximately $10,000. So they're worse off, but not a lot worse off. A super high income family, so say earning $7 million per year, if that's income and they're taxed at income, then they're paying around $2.5 million in taxes. They would receive $36,000 in UBI, which they probably wouldn't notice. Taxes would increase to around $3.8 million. And so their disposable income would fall from $4.5 million to $3.2 million, right? So they are definitely worse off by $1.3 million, but they're still rich, right? They're still in that, top 1% of 1% of income. So what about those child accounts? Well, remember, each child is receiving $6,000 every year for 18 years, and the other half is going to their parents to pay for their, food, shelter, etc. So that totals $108,000 even without any growth, right? So if we just stick it into a checking account, it's $108,000. If the total grows at 2% per year, all right, if we invest it in something safe, that would grow to about $130,000. And then that's $130,000 that could be used for college education, other job training, down payment for a house, starting a business, etc. And the idea here would be that it would equalize the financial resources between, at least to some extent, between children who grow up in poor families and children who grow up in middle class or rich families. There are a lot of other important issues that we would need to think about before putting this type of policy into place, right? There are macroeconomic issues. This is a huge redistribution of income that could change consumption patterns, that could have effects on inflation. It could cause huge employment shifts between industries. Those would all have to be thought about. It could have a big impact on federal employment, right? A lot of those safety net jobs would no longer be needed. And so that could be an issue. And there's probably a lot more that we would need to think about. So keeping all that in mind, is UBI a good idea? Personally, I think it's the best social safety net, as long as it's large enough, right? It's universal. There's much less bureaucracy. You're giving people money. They can decide what the best way to spend it is, right? Should that be focused on housing, on food, on clothing, on education? Each family can make their own decisions. But it is a huge change in how we organize society. There are a lot of unknowns, right? There are a lot of behavioral responses that we don't know. And certainly the economist in me says that we should test something like this before we do it. That said, the biggest change in our sort of financial social arrangement was probably Social Security, and we didn't really do a whole lot of tests on that. We just sort of did it, and then we made adjustments as we went along. And that would be one way to do UBI as well. So that's all for now. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any other suggestions for economic policies that you'd like me to review, leave them in the comments. I look forward to hearing from you, and have a good day.